This weekend marked the one-year anniversary of 2017's Unite the Right event in Charlottesville, Virginia, which memorably included ongoing violent clashes between white nationalist groups and Antifa challengers, ultimately resulting in the death of counter-protester Heather Heyer by car, the trial for which is set for November. And for weeks, there had been events scheduled for the anniversary weekend, with similar white nationalist groups and Antifa opposition expected in both Charlottesville and Washington, D.C. On Saturday, Charlottesville turned out to be a non-event, at least insofar as no Unite the Right or white nationalist people actually showed up. But Antifa groups have to harass somebody, so they went after cops and journalists instead.
Cops and the Klan go hand in hand. All cops are racist. Fuck you, snitch-ass news bitch. Fuck you. What's that?
Never mind that, though, said a lot of media outlets. We've got a white nationalist threat to hype. And if they weren't there on Saturday, you can bet they're gonna be there on Sunday.
Today, a large rally is planned in Washington, D.C., with a big police presence to meet them.
D.C. police will be flooding this area later today, trying to keep separate groups of white nationalists and counter-protesters, even as they converge on this small park later tonight.
Because it's going to be a showdown between those white supremacists and the counter-protesters. Just you wait. And you better pre-denounce. That's right, you better disavow early, before you could even know what you're disavowing at all. So get comfy there on the edge of your seat and endure the suspense, because this is one fight you won't want to miss. And then this was the scene. Yeah, that's all of them. Some 24 white nationalist guys led by Unite the Right organizer Jason Kessler. I saw some reports as high as 40, if you want to be generous. They walked from the metro station to the park across the street from the White House. They spoke briefly and then they left without incident. And that was it. Meanwhile, hundreds or maybe thousands of counter-protesters, including Antifa, Black Lives Matter, and others, made sure to amplify this perceived threat far beyond levels it would otherwise reach if simply left alone. The media hype had flopped, and this thing was nowhere near the event it was predicted to be. But at some level, I get it. Nobody wants to see repeat scenes like this from last year. If Charlottesville is the benchmark, it's prudent to prepare for something comparable, so I won't be too hard on media outlets expecting something similar. And I certainly won't be too tough on DC police for preparing for the worst. But you can't have it both ways. You can't hype up the risk and then complain about police presence. Either this is a huge deal, it's a huge threat to everybody, and therefore ought to be strictly controlled, or it's not a big deal and the security measures aren't necessary, but not both. And it's really frustrating to see many of the same media who hyped this event turn around after it flopped and blame the police for overreacting. Oh, those damn police, they were too accommodating to Kessler and his buddies. The police were giving them special treatment because they're secret white nationalists too. I can't believe they temporarily inconvenienced some people at the metro station with their increased security measures, but nobody was a bigger hypocrite on this issue than the Huffington Post. Not only do they hype the threat of white supremacism near daily and pathologically, but they hyped the threat of this weekend specifically with pieces like this. White supremacy didn't invade, it was always here. Yeah, except on its specifically designated weekend, apparently. That's the only time white supremacy inexplicably takes some time off and doesn't actually show up. Check out some of the commentary in their video piece about the looming danger of the white supremacist threat. Here's a pastor in Charlottesville.
I've really had my eyes opened to things like white privilege. I am a straight white male and have benefited from being such my entire life. I have not once ever had to deal with any discrimination based off of my skin color, based off of my gender. And so what do I do? What do I do with this power? It's like a Spider-Man quote. With great power comes great responsibility.
Tell me more about how anti-racist you are. Guy who believes he has inherent power over black people simply because of the color of his skin. Well, thank God you're using your powers for good, right? My, oh my, how virtuous. Here's some more from a local activist.
The white supremacy is not coming from outside, right? It's right here. As we move on and as we progress, we have to show up. Now is not the time to be silent or complicit, and your silence is violence. White silence is violence, so if you don't show up and you don't say anything, essentially you're on the side of the white supremacists and the side of hate.
No, I'm really not though. I'm only on the side of violence or hate if I participate in violence or hate. If I just ignore it and nothing really happens like this weekend, I've been neither hateful nor violent. Instead, I've been productive. So after telling us we have some moral obligation to go out into the streets and fight this existential threat, even when no threat shows up to fight, Huffington Post turns around and rips the police for keeping the peace. A couple dozen neo-Nazis got the red carpet treatment from DC law enforcement, they write, complaining specifically about a few things. Taxpayer-funded law enforcement separated the white nationalists from the public on a private train car, which is, in fact, true. They got their own special car on the DC metro system. It was even labeled special, just for them. And the cops provided them with a private entrance into the park, also true, insofar as the police escorted the group from the metro station to the park where they spoke. One of the authors of the article further complained on Twitter an astounding amount of police presence for a few dozen white supremacists. Police say after Charlottesville, they weren't taking any chances. Their strategy was to keep the two sides separated to prevent violence like we saw last year. And isn't that the point? Isn't that the irony? The Huffington Post pushes this hysteria about some supposed gigantic threat. We all have this moral obligation to go fight in the streets, thus amplifying an event that would otherwise be nothing. If you don't like heavy policing, don't contribute to an environment that requires it. And by the way, there's plenty of evidence that it was, in fact, required. Not because of the supposed threat that you warn about, Huffington Post, but because of the self-righteous zealotry that you help to inspire. People who believe in this threat that you hype harassed police officers and civilians all day. Here's a white hero lecturing black cops about how they're part of the modern KKK.
Motherfuck you! Motherfuck you! You're fucking weird! Fashion piece of shit! Fuck you! Fuck you! Fuck you!
Here are others throwing objects and pouring liquid on passersby just for wearing Trump shirts. Here are others launching fireworks and tossing eggs at cops. Here they are marching and threatening violence. It takes a bullet to bash the fash. Violent attitudes were common among the supposed good guys. Check out Benny Johnson from the Daily Caller asking these protesters what they would do if they could access the president.
What would you do if Donald Trump showed up at the Trump? Murder him? Murder him for the people?
He's America's Caesar, except he's a dickhead. So you gotta take him down.
If it came down to it and it was a group effort, we'd have to do him like Gaddafi.
If the president showed up at this march, what would you do, sir?
Beat his ass.
Beat his ass?
Reportedly, the Secret Service is aware of these threats and may be investigating. Amid all this evidence, that Huffington Post reporter's take is amazingly blind. It's not just a police presence for a few dozen white supremacists. It's a police presence for the other side, too. Another side you continually radicalize and apologize for. If instead of hyping this threat and invoking a moral duty to counter it in the streets, you gave the Unite the Right rally the treatment it deserves, deaf ears and blind eyes, it wouldn't be news. Because it doesn't deserve to be news. So to the Huffington Post and the rest of the media who claim to stand in opposition to white supremacism or white nationalism or whatever you want to call it, it wasn't Jason Kessler or his friends that made racial tension a national headline this weekend. That was all you. If instead you'd prefer racial peace and minimized police presence, stop inciting racial hatred and violence that necessitates police presence. At this point, you're not reporting the news, you're creating it. So if you don't like what you see, stop writing these exaggerated, inflated, wolf-crying, sky is falling, chicken little bullshit headlines, and I guarantee you, the stories you created will disappear. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below and especially over on Twitter. That is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to come hang out and chat in my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.